Welcome to this episode of Live Without Training Wheels. I am so glad that you all are here with me. We are going to talk about a very tricky, very sensitive topic tonight. We're going to be talking about homeschooling through depression. And I'm going to get started on that in a little bit, but I just want to say up front that this is an issue that has been on my heart for quite some time to talk about. And I have been just thinking about this and praying about it for quite some time, but especially today. And I just want to be an encouragement and a blessing to you all. So I'm going to go through some little startup details to make sure that you're comfy here and that you know how to find your way around and enjoy this broadcast. But if you would you pray for me to be a blessing tonight as I get started here and go through these setup details? If you're not familiar with this show, we live broadcast through a program called Crowdcast. The interaction here is great. The opportunity for comments and questions is really excellent. But I stream that right to YouTube and Facebook so that those who follow me there can also see the broadcast. So if you're watching from YouTube or Facebook and you want to stay there, feel free. But if you would like to come into the Crowdcast event with us and have an opportunity to interact live, then you'll just want to look in the video description for the link to this Crowdcast event. And then if you are watching in Crowdcast, I highly recommend watching through a desktop or laptop because it's easier to type with your fingers if you want to comment and ask questions. But if you're watching on mobile, that's fine too. You'll just want to make sure to turn it in landscape mode. And then there's a little box in the top right corner, kind of looks like a broken square. Click that to have a full screen view. And then tap in the bottom right corner to see the chat window if you're interested in keeping up with what's going on there. And then a couple of other details to keep in mind here in Crowdcast are at the bottom of the screen, we have a poll. And as usual, the poll is completely anonymous. So if you want to respond there, it just kind of helps me to have a little bit of background on the audience in general, but I won't be able to know anything specifically about those who responded. And also right next to the button that says polls is a button that says ask a question. So if you have a question that you'd like to type in, you can definitely enter that at any time during the discussion. Also, if somebody types a comment over in the comment box that would be helpful to be addressed as a question in the Q&A section at the end, I can actually just click and move that over to the ask a question box. One of the things I love about the ask a question box is that you can actually upvote things that are most relevant to you. So if you see that someone else has asked a question and it looks like something that you'd like to hear about as well, go ahead and upvote it. Now, sometimes we have time to get through all the questions that are asked. Sometimes we run out of time. It just kind of depends on the topic and the crowd that we've got here. But if we upvote questions, then that way that at the end of the talk, when I start into the Q&A segment, I can begin with the questions that will be of the most help to the most people, just in case I'm not able to get through all of them as we're here live together. But usually, even if I'm not able to get through all of them when we're live, I'll just go back and type some text responses to those questions we didn't get a chance to discuss. Another cool thing about the Ask a Question feature is that as I'm answering the questions, I'm actually clicking a button here in my host view, and it timestamps those answers. So if you're watching this on the replay, you can open the Ask a Question box and you can look at the questions that we've talked about, and you'll be able to click right on a button next to each of those questions to jump right to the place in the video where we talked about it. So that's especially useful if you've asked a question and then for some reason you have to head off, maybe toddlers or middle schoolers or whatever might be going on in your life that interrupts your ability to listen. If you miss the answer to your question, you can hop right to it when you watch the replay. Okay, let me see if there's anything else I wanted to mention. Okay, I think we've covered it. So let's go ahead and jump into what we're here to talk about tonight, and that is homeschooling through depression. And I want to start out, I hope this is fairly obvious, but I felt it was important to say, I'm not a medical doctor. I am not a licensed healthcare provider or mental health professional in any form. And what I'm sharing here tonight is simply my own experiences and my own reflections on those experiences. I don't intend for it to be the last word on depression or homeschooling through depression. It's certainly not exhaustive. There's so much that could be said. My experience is not normative. It's simply my experience. So please take whatever you hear here with that lens in mind. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about my history with depression, not because it's all about me, or again, not because my story is normative, but just because this is such a sensitive topic that I feel like if you're going to listen to what someone has to say about it, it can be helpful just to know exactly who is talking to you and what they have to say about that topic, and kind of what their background or story is behind that topic. So, my first experience with postpartum depression was almost 8 years ago. It was right after the birth of my fifth child. I'd never had any kind of, I'd had, baby blues or low moments or times or whatever before, but nothing that was long lasting and that seemed to not go away. And so my first experience, as I said, was after the birth of my fifth child. And so I had 4 other children who were, the oldest was a 6-year-old. So 4 children, ages 6 and under, plus a newborn. And he was a big baby and he nursed a lot all the time. And I was constantly exhausted. So for me, if you've not had your own experience of depression, your impression might be that it's about being really sad. And that definitely was the case for me. Very low, very sad, but also extreme fatigue, no energy, just completely exhausted all the time. And so I actually spent a lot of time laying on the floor. We have this room at the back of our house that we call the schoolroom. Probably like normal people would call it a den or a family room, but we call it the schoolroom. It's where we keep all the school books and that kind of thing. And it's also kind of a playroom. And so I spent a long time laying at the doorway to that room because I was exhausted and I just wanted to sleep all the time. But I was a mommy and I was in charge of all these little people, and they were all little people. And so I needed to keep them from escaping from that room and getting off into the house and causing mayhem. So I would lay there in the doorway so that they could not get out of the room without me being aware. They basically would have to climb over me to get out of the room. And I've shared this before, but during that time, I struggled with being very angry with God, because I had this feeling that, hey, I'm doing all of these right things. I'm checking all these boxes. Here I've got these 5 children and I am homeschooling them and I am nursing this baby. And why am I having to suffer this really awful thing when I am doing all the quote unquote right things? And, so it was a really eye-opening experience for me, just in terms of realizing that I felt sort of entitled. And I'm by no means trying to spread this application to anyone else listening here. I'm simply sharing my own realization during that first experience of postpartum depression for me. But, just realizing that I was thinking of homeschooling and having a large family and all these other little things as kind of like I was earning myself extra brownie points, and as though I was entitled to a certain kind of life or experience or freedom from suffering or whatever, based on all those quote unquote right choices that I was making. And one of the things that was really a blessing to me about that experience of postpartum depression was that it ended almost exactly coinciding with when my menstrual cycle started again. And, I know that one of the things that can be so difficult about depression, and was difficult for me and has been difficult for me, even given this, is this struggle in your mind about like, am I making a big deal out of nothing? Am I being a drama queen? Am I, I just have a bad attitude for like months at a time? Is this me not trying hard enough? Is this me making a big deal out of nothing? But the fact that for me, it ended right when my cycle returned really helped me to have kind of proof and confidence that no, this really was a chemical, hormonal, biological thing that was happening in my body. And, not that there are no spiritual struggles that come along with that kind of suffering. And we'll talk more about that later. But this was a real physical, biological thing that was happening. And I don't think that's only true of postpartum depression, but it was just a blessing that in that scenario, I was able to have this really clear evidence that, yep, this was something that my body was doing. Pregnancy number 6 was totally fine. I had no postpartum depression after the pregnancy whatsoever. I don't know why. Pregnancy number 7, I began with depression at the beginning of pregnancy. It lasted for the entire pregnancy. Now, it was normal for me to be pretty fatigued at the beginning of pregnancy. And so at the beginning, I just thought, right, this is typical first trimester, but it never went away. And so it lasted for the whole pregnancy and for the whole postpartum. And even after I had weaned, it continued. And at that point, we were thinking maybe we should be done. Maybe we shouldn't try again for another baby, because it wasn't just, oh, this is so hard, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not going to lie, that was definitely a part of it. But another part of it was I am really struggling to function as a grown-up here. I'm really struggling to be able to be, hi, Jessica, to be able to be a mommy and take care of these children and, just continue to carry on with my even basic responsibilities. So it wasn't just a matter of like, oh, I don't want to feel yucky anymore. It was, is this responsible for us to do this, when it really kind of sidelined me so severely? Now, at a certain point, we were looking into, we thought about all kinds of things. And I won't go into all the details of what we researched and tried and whatever, but one of the things that we tried was vitamin D. And I did find out that I had a pretty significant vitamin D deficiency. And I began taking supplements, and my number, I don't remember what the numbers are. I can't remember what's being measured and what the normal range is, whatever. But whatever it was significantly low. I took the supplements. Within 6 weeks, it had risen significantly, and I felt so much better. And so in my mind, that was confirmation that, oh, this was a vitamin D deficiency. And, now that I'm on the vitamin D, I feel so much better. So we've solved the problem. That's what it was. It was a vitamin D thing. And that little bit of experience and information gave us, it kind of renewed the conversation about, should we have another baby? And at that point, we had waited and waited, not wanting to have another pregnancy at that point. And so we were at the point where, if we were to get pregnant right away, the baby number 7 and baby number 8 would be over 2 years apart. And I was already, towards the end of my 30s. And we felt like, okay, if we found the problem and it was this vitamin D deficiency and we're going to have one more baby, let's go ahead and do it, because we didn't want to just keep waiting and waiting. Our last 2 would already be further apart than any of our other children had been. And I know you can totally laugh at me for thinking that 2.5 years is a lot of space between babies, but, just chalk it up to life that I had known up until that point. So all that to say, I had about 1 healthy month after recovering from baby number 7 before I got pregnant again with baby number 8, and was immediately plunged back down into depression, which then lasted for the entire pregnancy and for the entire postpartum until I weaned early. He was 10 months old. And I weaned him, he was old enough where I was willing to start trying to give him cow's milk, like, from the grocery store, because I was so desperate for something that would help me to be able to return to more balanced hormones. And just as a side note, if you need to wean in order to get relief, do it, and don't feel any shame. It's a way to love your family. I'm not putting any pressure on anybody about that, but I'm just going to say it. That was helpful to me in that particular situation. So all total, it was a little over 4 years, minus that 1 month that I felt good in between baby 7 and 8. It was about 4 pretty low, pretty hard years. Now, I know depression is a big spectrum, and I don't even know, you can't chart it and say like, oh, well, that was a 4.5 as opposed to somebody else who had like a 7. I can't, aside from like letting you see inside my head, there's no way I could really communicate to you how hard it was or what that was like. I will say, that I never was struggling with suicidal thoughts or thoughts of harming my children or anything like that. And I know, those who have. And so I would assume that that would mean that they had a more difficult struggle with depression than I did. I know that mine is by far not, one of the most severe or tragic or difficult. And I don't mean to put it out there as though I, have some kind of stellar track record with really, really hard depression, but I, definitely a long-term experience and a lot of thinking, praying, researching, talking to people about it. So just a little bit of background. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to tell you some bits of advice. And I'm going to do this in pairs of information. And here's why. When I was struggling with depression, if I had seen a webinar or something like that that said homeschooling through depression or, tips on handling depression, I probably would have run the other way, because the last thing that I would have wanted would have been somebody who's telling me, oh, just, check these boxes, just do these things. And, after a while you realize there might not be a thing like that. And you've been through all the ups and downs of like, oh, maybe it's this, I'll try this. Oh, maybe this will help. Well, maybe that will make it go away. And so I want to tell you right from the start that this is not a long checklist of to-dos. This is more a list of pairs of things to help you think about your experience and really honestly, truthfully, to encourage you in knowing that you are not alone. If there's nothing else that you take away from this, it's just knowing that you are not alone. So let's start with number one. And here are two related pieces of advice. One is that you totally can keep homeschooling through depression. It can be a fantastic lifelong learning experience for your children because they are going to see a very real, very difficult slice of life. And there will be opportunities for many good conversations and for your husband or your other family members to have good interactions with your children about what's going on. I think it was valuable for my children to see that, having a family is a complex, complicated thing. It's not all roses and sunshine and family portraits to mount over the fireplace. There are dark, hard, scary, difficult things that happen in the course of life in a family. And I think, that was something it wasn't checking the boxes on the math lessons or the social studies lessons, but my children were learning some very valuable things during that time and a lot of compassion and stepping up and helping with things. And here's a funny thing, and I'm speaking only from my own experience, but when we went through multiple phases of struggling with depression, it really forced me to scale our schedule and our, the things that we were trying to accomplish way, way back to like the bare minimum. And at the time I told myself, I'm only doing this because we're in survival mode. And, someday we'll put back all these things in our schedule when we're back to normal. And I have to say, most of the things that I eliminated from our schedule have stayed eliminated. Even though I'm feeling much better now, I learned a ton about the value of giving my children a lot of margin in their day and a lot of free time and watching them develop hobbies and skills and, things to do with their free time that were really good, valuable things for them to do that I don't know, given my own way. And if I had been in control, like I wanted to be in control, if there would have been margin in the schedule for those kinds of things. I think my personality is to kind of, organize and regiment everything and have everything all structured and filled in and, 15-minute increments and all that. And so for me personally, it was a mercy that the Lord brought me to the place where I couldn't do that anymore. And I had the opportunity to, see what would happen when their schedules weren't filled up. Let's see. Amy says, it's hard to see any blessings to the children while mom struggles through depression. Appreciate that perspective. And Amy, I want to say right now that I don't know that this is something that I would have seen during the depression. So you really need to remember, and I hope you know this, but I'm speaking in retrospect, right? So if you are struggling right now with depression and you're saying That's lovely. I don't see any perks. I don't see any benefits. That is okay. And you don't have to. And I'm not sharing this because I'm trying to convince you that it's not as bad as it seems. And, oh, there's a silver lining to every cloud and all that. I'm just relating that there actually were benefits to homeschooling through depression. Now, the companion piece of information that I want to share along with that is, yes, you can totally keep homeschooling through depression. And also, you don't have to. And I'm saying this up front because, again, knowing myself and knowing how my heart works and how my fears and anxieties plagued me when I was struggling, if I had watched a video of a mom talking about, oh, yes, I had depression and I kept homeschooling, then that would then begin to beat me up. Well, there's that lady and she did it and she's got 8 kids. And so I don't know what's wrong with me and I should be able to do this too. And I'm going to keep repeating this, but my experience is not normative. There are so many factors that go into your experience of homeschooling through depression. So it could be, what kind of support you have around you, what kind of family you have around you. Both my parents and my in-laws live in town and are extremely helpful and supportive. My husband he works a job that's, kind of a 9 to 5 and he doesn't bring anything home with him and he can work from home sometimes. So there are just tons of factors that go into everyone's particular experience of depression, even apart from the fact that, the severity of the depression can vary. So I'm here to talk about if you want to keep homeschooling through depression, or if that's what you need to do, let me encourage you. I'm not here to say, see, I proved you should do it too, because I can do it, so everybody should do it. Please don't hear me say that. And please don't walk away from this saying, I have to do it now because some lady on the internet can do it. That's not the purpose of this message. Okay, the next pieces of advice, the next pair of pieces of advice. First of all, you should feel free to talk about your depression. If you're wondering if you can share it, if you're wondering if it's okay to talk about, then I want to encourage you that it can be so helpful to talk out loud about it. And it's not something that you need to be ashamed of. It is not a character flaw. It's not a lack of moral qualities or anything like that if this is a struggle that you're having. And so I want you to feel free to talk about it if you want to do that. However, the companion piece of advice is it's also totally fine not to tell people or not to tell certain people. So, for example, with a lot of things, not just depression, but with a lot of things you'll see on social media, like, we have to talk about this. We have to be open about, these struggles because people don't know that this problem exists or people don't realize what it's like. And so those of us who've experienced it, we have to talk about it. And boy, I am all for promoting, let's be open about our experience and all that. But it requires a pretty hefty amount of emotional bandwidth to share what you're struggling with. And so if you're saying to yourself, I don't really have any extra emotional bandwidth right now, you're not responsible to a movement, right? You are not the face of depression in America today, or, the face of homeschooling with depression. And sometimes there are people with whom you share and it's very helpful. And then there are other times where you share with somebody and now you're having to process some super unhelpful feedback that you got. And, so there were definitely, I think if you're struggling and you have told no one, that's probably problematic. This is a really, really hard one to do completely alone. But if you've told 2 or 3 people that you're very close to and that you can trust with that information, you don't need to tell any one particular person or any one, group of people or whatever. And, I definitely had people say, and I know that they were, well-meaning, but when I talked after the fact about it, people would say, well, you didn't tell us. We could have been praying for you, almost a little bit in like a scolding kind of way. And I understand, and I know that their desire was, I wish I'd known, I could have prayed for you. That's very, very loving. But you are not obligated to tell anybody. There's nobody, and I'm just talking about like the large circle of people that You are free to choose who you tell and who you don't tell, how many people you tell, how often you talk about it, what you share. You're not responsible to other people to keep them in the loop about your life or anything like that. Let's see. Joanna says, yes, yuck, agreed. Amy says, most feedback adds to the hurt and struggle. Sharing needs to be oh so selective. And amongst homeschool circles, it's even harder. So certainly appreciate you sharing and encouraging. Yes. And here's another thing to keep in mind. And that is that not everybody has the spiritual maturity even to handle you sharing about dark, hard things that are happening to you. It takes somebody with a little bit of growth and wisdom to be able to hear about not just depression, but about other people's struggles without kind of being pulled down by that, you know? So it's okay to say, you know what, I don't think I'm going to share that with that person right now. It does not mean that you're being fake. It does not mean that you are trying to live a lie. And if somebody says that to you, that is not the kind of person that you need to be sharing those struggles with. You don't need to tell every person you know everything about you in order to be quote unquote real. It's called wisdom. It's called using discretion. You should feel free to talk about it. You also don't have to talk about it. Okay, pair of thoughts number 3. You should feel free to ask for help. Okay, so one of the biggest struggles that I had with depression was that it felt like not real, right? Like some people are pregnant and they have morning sickness and they're throwing up all the time, and they might even have to be hospitalized to get IV, transfusions to be rehydrated. Depression feels so pretend, and it's not, and I'm not saying that it is, but it can feel like this thing that's just in your head. And it feels really weird to ask for help when you can't really back it up with any kind of objective facts. You can say, I pretty much am crying all day and I wish that I could stay in bed all the time. But that just sort of sounds like, okay, so maybe you need to pull it together and listen to some happy music and dance in the kitchen or something, right? But oftentimes when we speak with confidence about this is what is happening in my life. I am not able to do these things. I need some help with this. Then, I'm surprised. We can be surprised at how many people will say, okay, if that's your, explanation of the circumstances, then I, have confidence in that. And we're not doubted and second guessed as much as we might expect that we might be. Amy says, man, so very true. No proof, like trying to point out a ghost in the room or something. Yes. Jessica says, I feel like it can be burdensome, which makes it hard to ask for help. Joanna says, we want everything so black and white, backed by science. Right. Yes. Yes to all of those. Yes. And you know what, Jessica, I'm not going to promise you that there are not people who, you might ask them for help and they might react like, well, that's kind of an imposition and, well, that's kind of burdensome, in which case that's not a person from whom you want help. Because when you're struggling with depression already, you really don't want people who are going to kind of give off this vibe of like, you need to pull yourself together and what's wrong with you. And it's very burdensome that you're asking for help. So the companion piece of wisdom to go along with you should feel free to ask for help is, it is also okay to not ask for help, because I feel like we can get in this guilt loop where we're saying, yes, it is totally okay for me to ask for help. But then it's like, oh, if you don't ask for help, well, then you must just be prideful and you must just be, the kind of person who, just wants to be self-sufficient and they just want to do it all by themselves and they're too prideful to let other people into their homes. And you know what? If that's your issue, okay, fine. But there are totally legitimate and reasonable reasons for not wanting help or for not wanting particular kinds of help. Okay, so for example, I really did not want outside people in my home all the time. I didn't want people to come in and stay, with us in the home during the day, because I just needed to have the freedom to, wear my pajamas and cry if I needed to. And, there are people with whom I could do that. Like my mother, I'm very blessed. My mother lives in town every other Thursday. She comes to our house. She helps out in our homeschool. That is a situation where she could be in our house, no matter the situation in the house, no matter what I'm wearing, no matter my emotional mood, my mother could be in the house. Not everybody is like that, right? And so there were people who said, oh, how can I help? And I just, said nothing right now. There's not really anything right now, because it really was better for us in most ways to just kind of muddle through on our own, way, way, way lower the standards, do the bare minimum, and just to, have the safe space and the privacy of my own home. That was just better for us most of the time. Now, there were a few things that people very lovingly did that were a lot easier for me to ask for help with. So, for example, my elder and his wife came and picked up our two oldest to take them to youth group. And for me, that was very helpful because church is far enough away from us that even though youth group is 3 hours long, it just would have not made sense to drive there, drive home again, drive there to pick them up, drive home again. So I would have needed to stay there. And that would have really been exhausting for me. It was on a Saturday night. And probably if I had taken the kids to youth group and stayed the whole time and then come home late at night, I wouldn't have been able to make it to church in the morning. It would have completely wiped me out. And so, it was a great way for them to help because they could pick up the kids, take them to youth group, bring them home again. They weren't really in our home, so we still kind of had our privacy, but it made a big difference to the kids. It made a big difference to us. It was very helpful. Another thing is I have a friend of ours from church who lives pretty close to us, and she would actually come and pick up our laundry and take it to her house and do it. And then she or her husband would deliver it, like folded in baskets and clothes hanging on coat hangers. She would take massive amounts of empty coat hangers with her. So I actually had laundry done for me without ever, without having her in my home, which she's a lovely person. And I know it sounds awful to say, I just wouldn't want her in my home. It's nothing to do with her. It's just, it takes a lot of emotional bandwidth to do everything when you're depressed, and you can't be flippant about how you spend that emotional energy. You just have to be super, super careful about rationing it out. And having somebody extra in my home would take too much bandwidth. Let's see. Joanna says, we want everything to be so black and white. Was laughed by a pastor in church one time. Yikes. Special people can do that. Be in your home and you can still be totally comfortable. Right. Still have to be careful of that myself, managing energy. Right. And so again, I had a mom who messaged me and said, I'm dealing with chronic pain. Would this talk be helpful? Yes, because there's a lot of overlap, right? A lot of the things I'm talking about are not only true of depression. They are true of depression, but there's overlap with, chronic pain and other things like that are ongoing and difficult situations. So, Joanna's saying, even outside of depression, there can be circumstances, even just being a mom of a lot of children, you have to be careful how you spend your energy. So you should feel free to ask for help. And also, it's okay to not ask for help or to decline help that's offered to you. All right. We talked about this before, but this is real. It's not pretend. Okay. It's not something that you can just take care of by trying harder or changing your thinking or having a better attitude or, praying more or having faith or something like that. This is a chemical, biological thing that is happening in your body. And I'm going to link to this in the show notes. There's an article that Kara Anderson wrote on Pam Barnhill's blog about anxiety. And I think a lot of the things that she said about anxiety really apply as well to depression. It's a similar, kind of one of those hidden illnesses, they would say. And she said, my husband has type 1 diabetes. And if his blood sugar was crashing, nobody would look at him and say, just pull yourself together, just try harder, right? There's something actually physically going on in his body that he can't just fix with an attitude adjustment. And the same thing is so true of depression. As a matter of fact, I told my husband about that article and how encouraging it was. And he said, right. I mean, as if you aren't already trying as hard as you can to even function at the level that you're already functioning. And that comment was such a blessing to me because I tended to measure how well I was handling it by comparing where I was with where I would have liked to be, or where I was with where I used to be before depression. Whereas he was comparing, how much energy it takes to function at that level normally versus how much energy I was expending to function at that level during depression. And he was honoring that, effort that I was putting forth to just look like, passably normal and how much effort that was taking. Mary Beth said, I think that chronic anything, whether it's depression, anxiety, illness, means that everything is harder. Mary Beth, amen. Amen. Joanna says, Ann Voskamp had an amazing article about, the suspense is killing me. I bet you hit enter too soon. Now I need to hear what the rest of that article was about. Depression. Okay. Yes. Okay. Well, good. If you find a link for that, post it. Depression and crutch. Waiting to hear more. Okay. So this is real. It's not pretend. But also the companion piece of advice to that is that it doesn't define you. And it doesn't necessarily invade every single ounce of every single moment of your life. So something that your friends might not realize is that, you can still look at your chubby baby in the bathtub and enjoy that moment, right? Depression does put this kind of gray veneer over everything, and it does level out a lot of the high, joyful moments that you might have. But that doesn't mean that you can't still laugh at a funny joke or, see your big son holding his little sister and just say, that is so beautiful. I'm so thankful for that. And I remember, a friend sharing that she knew I had been struggling with depression, but she thought I must be better because she'd seen me posting, happy things on social media. And this is not, to criticize that friend or anything like that, but it just made me realize that, society has an impression of, a person who has depression, they must just be weeping into a handkerchief all the time. And that's not necessarily the case, right? You could be at church and you could be smiling and you could have, nice conversation with somebody and still be really, really hurting on the inside. So, it doesn't mean that you have nothing to offer, like that as though all of the wisdom and all of the experience that you've gained over the years in your life is somehow evaporated. It doesn't mean that you have no skills or talents or gifts. It doesn't erase and invade every portion and part of who you are, but it is very real. Okay, so Joanna filled in some more details. Depression and whether help was a crutch or not, and it changed her life. And so she's going to look up that link for us. Amy says, many misunderstandings abound on what depression looks like. Right. Okay, so that follows right through to the next thing I was going to say, which is that people who have been through this can be a great resource. People who have actually experienced this can really help with that, just if nothing else, just saying, oh, yes, I know exactly what you mean. Oh, yes, I can so relate to that feeling, or that analogy just really strikes home with me. That can be so encouraging. And so finding folks who have that struggle in their past or currently can be such a treasure. However, the companion piece of information to that is that sometimes people who've struggled with depression may have their own insecurities. They may have, maybe they've decided to do this or not do this thing or other thing in order to manage the depression or handle the depression. And so perhaps your choices about what to do or not to do are a threat to them. Now, I don't say this to warn you off of ever talking to anyone who's also struggled with depression, because I think by and large, it can be encouraging and helpful. But the reason I say it is this. Occasionally, you will come across someone who's had a similar struggle to what you've got, whether it's depression or anything else, and they will say, yes, but you know what I've found? I've discovered this. And, in our culture particularly, experience is a powerful marker of authority. Like if someone has had this experience, then they really know what they're talking about. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong. But sometimes we get a little thrown off when somebody says, well, I've had depression and I realized that you must do this, or you have to do this, or you can't do it this way, or you whatever. And sometimes that throws us even more than someone who's never experienced this and has opinions about what you should do. Because when they have experienced it, it kind of makes us go, oh, and they know what they're talking about. Find someone who has a similar experience, but who's able to share in the experience with compassion. And if it seems like, that maybe what you're sharing is triggering some of their own struggles or their own insecurities, they just might not be at a place right now where they're able to be a support for you. They might need people around them who are able to support them. And, it might be the same thing for you. If somebody who is struggling with depression is coming to you for help and support, and you're feeling like trying to help and support them is causing, a lot of panic or insecurities for you, then certainly that person needs love and support. And maybe someday you can be that, but it's okay to say, I can't be that for you right now. I mean, not necessarily in so many words, but it's okay to decide that in your mind. Okay, let's see. Jessica says, and anxiety. Amy says, and yet we don't walk around with an indicator that lets others know we've had it or are in it. It's an invisible struggle. Right. Yes, Amy, it's true. It's hard to sometimes know how to connect. Jessica said, it's hard for people to understand what you're going through because no one else is the same. And that's so true of anything, right? You could, any kind of struggle or suffering that you've endured, nobody else's experience of it, even if it's the same category of suffering, nobody else's experience is exactly the same as yours. Okay. One half of the next piece of advice is doing things to help you feel better doesn't mean that you were doing it wrong to begin with. So for example, if you're reading online and you're thinking, you know what, maybe it would help me if I did this or that. One of the things I struggled with was I would always have this great hope, like, oh, this could be it. Maybe this will help. Maybe this will fix it. But on the other hand, at the same time, I had this fear, like, oh no, if I take this vitamin and it makes me feel better, then that means this whole time I have been suffering just because I was too stupid to take vitamins. Or if I get moving and I walk every morning and that fixes my problem, then that means that this whole time God's been punishing me for not walking, for not exercising, or whatever. I'm not advocating this way of thinking. I'm just saying this is how my mind was spinning. I was afraid that if I did something that was helpful, then it would be confirmation that my suffering was due to the fact that I was doing it wrong to begin with. And you know what? That is really not true. First of all, I didn't find anything that, Amy says the mental conversations we have with ourselves, man, I understand. So, if this is a biological chemical problem that's happening in your body, then it's not going to be something that you're going to fix with like drinking more water or something like that. But even so, there were things that I could do I described it like this. So there were thought patterns or activities or things that I would do that would like cause me to sink deeper. And then there are other things that I would do that would kind of help me to tread water, like not cure me, not fix it, but just like treading water versus sinking deeper. So all of those things that you hear about, like fresh air and sunshine and, nourishing foods and moving and fellowship with people who are supportive and, something to laugh at, listening to music, whatever kind of music is encouraging or uplifting, or sermons or podcasts or all of these things were good, like not cures, but like treading water kinds of activities. And I remember at one point at the beginning of my first experience of postpartum depression, there was no, I'd never had postpartum depression before. I'd never had any kind of depression before. And so the main symptom that I recognized was fatigue. So I just thought I was really tired. And of course, when you've got a newborn, it's like, well, how do I know when this is more than normal tiredness? Because I do have a newborn and I'm nursing. And so, when I would describe to people how I was doing, I would just say, I'm really tired. And so everybody's responses and suggestions were not really related to depression, but just when you're fatigued. And one person was saying, oh, you know what? You need to drink more water, because I just found that I was always so lethargic until I started drinking 64 ounces of water a day. And then I felt much better. And I can remember, that was a suggestion someone made at church. And I can remember on the ride home from church, crying to my husband and just saying, like, what if this whole experience that I've been through, what if the purpose of this whole experience is that God is just trying to teach me that I need to drink 64 ounces of water a day. Like, I don't think I can handle it if that's the grand purpose of this really hard experience. And of course, it wasn't. Mary Beth says, some days treading water is just enough, and that's okay. Yes, yes. And Jessica says, ding, 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 the mind is so complex. Totally true. Totally true. So, yes, there are things that can help. But even if you find something that helps you a little bit, that doesn't mean, oh, yeah, you were suffering because you were failing to do this thing you were supposed to do. And then the flip side of that is, you know what? It is okay to not do even things that might help you. So there's a clinic in my area that offers integrative medicine. Like they will do medication and things like that, but they also do a lot of food and nutrition and that kind of thing. And so they had this big program, which first of all, it's pretty expensive, but they would do this whole dietary thing with you. And then, medication was also an option if they couldn't get the dietary things ironed out. And theoretically, in my mind, that sounded really ideal, right? Like if there's something wrong with my diet or if there's some food sensitivity I have or whatever, then I want to know about that. I want to eat healthy. But the first step on this program was a pretty serious elimination diet. And I'm not knocking the clinic or the diet or anything like that. And I'm sure that there are people who've been helped by that sort of thing. But my husband and I talked about it, and we just felt like realistically, I was not going to be able to do that. Like I just was not functioning at a level where I could make a whole bunch of radical dietary changes and continue just to function as a mom. And so, that might have been a great way to go, but we just needed to say, like, not possible right now, not realistic. And it was hard for me to step away from something because it felt like, oh, well, if there's this possibility that could help me, then it seems like lazy or wrong or irresponsible to not just try everything. But the fact of the matter is, this is a life in a fallen world. And we know this in our heads, right? But we forget it when we're trying to work out the details of a particular situation. You cannot lifestyle away the fallenness of this world. Absolutely take good care of your body and eat healthy foods and all that stuff. But don't expect that you're going to be able to avoid all struggles, all suffering, all difficulties in this life just by lifestyle choices and diet and all that stuff. I mean, I know not everybody's experience of depression is related to, childbearing and pregnancy and all that. But have we forgotten that God specifically said that childbearing was one of the effects of the fall? I mean, our, pain in childbearing. And I don't think that just means like, oh, it hurts to push out a baby. But, so much of this is related to our hormonal cycles and the ups and downs of the phases of life. And, if we think that we should be able to check all these boxes and make all these choices and no longer be living in a fallen world and a fallen body, hello, that's a theological error right there. So it is okay to not do everything possible that you've ever read about on the internet to fix your problem. Okay, good, ladies. I'm glad that that's encouraging for you because that was an eye-opening thing for me. It was really helpful. Amy says, you cannot lifestyle away the consequences of this fallen world. Natalie says, you cannot lifestyle away the consequences of this fallen world. Joanna says she loves it. It's going on her mirror. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. That is encouragement from the Lord to me, which I'm very thrilled to be able to share with you. Okay, this is really obvious, but it needs to be said. Number one, you don't need to know the why. Job, we don't have any record in the Bible that Job really ever knew all the behind the scenes stuff that was going on, what the struggles that he was having. And maybe it would not have been helpful, for him to know or for God to say to Job, oh yeah, well, it's just this cosmic argument that I have with Satan. And so we're kind of messing with your life and your children and everything, so that I can make this narrative that's going to go in the Bible and it's going to help people for a long time. We don't know that Job ever really knew that. I guess he knows it now, but we don't always know the why. And I'm kind of glad we don't necessarily need to know, why is God doing this? What's the big picture? But we do know the big general why, which is, and I know this seems like, it's this cliche verse that's overused, but first of all, Romans 8:28, all things work together for good. And that doesn't mean like, oh, I had this car and I got in a car accident and it crashed and that seemed bad, but then I got this nicer car. So look, all things work together for good. It might mean that we have some material benefits, but spiritually. So the verse that I really clung to, really actually the whole fourth chapter of Second Corinthians, but especially this verse, verse 16. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. And I know that sounds kind of morbid for, a 37, 38-year-old woman to be talking about her outer self wasting away as though my body was just, decaying. But that's kind of how I felt. I felt like my body was completely flunking out on me and just kind of crumbling out from underneath me. Joanna, that was 2 Corinthians 4:16. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. And it was so encouraging to me to be reminded that no matter what happened with my body, it's temporary and it's going to go away eventually anyway. But the renewal of my inner man that was happening, not because I could necessarily see it or measure it, but because God said it's happening, my inner self being renewed day by day, nothing could touch that. And no one could take that away from me ever. So that was so encouraging to me to remember. Okay, this is taking a lot longer than I planned for it to take. Next pair of pieces of advice is that it's okay to cry in front of the kids, and it's also okay not to cry in front of the kids. I talked earlier about how it's helpful for them to see that, and it's led to some good conversations. But just like we talked about, you have to be really careful with your expenditure of energy and especially emotional energy. And sometimes I just did not have the capacity to cry in front of the children and then to help them process seeing mommy crying. And so sometimes it was better for me to this is what I did a lot, take a shower, because I could shut the door, I could turn on the overhead fan, turn on the water and cry and cry and cry. And they couldn't hear. And I could just sob right out loud and they couldn't hear it. And then I could, kind of get that emotional release without having to then hold their hand through processing that mommy was crying. And, what I would often say to them when they saw me crying or heard me crying was, everything on the outside of us is just fine. I love you guys. I'm happy to be in this family. Daddy and I are fine. Like, there is nothing going on in life that is a danger to you at all. We are safe and we are fine. There's just something going on inside of mommy that tells mommy that things are really sad even when they're not. And I think that was helpful to them, but it was also okay for me to choose not to process that in front of them. And my experience, at least, was I would worry that if I started crying, I wouldn't be able to stop. And I didn't really have that experience. I mean, it never really made the sadness completely go away, but that feeling of like being ready to burst, I really could kind of let it out and it would work itself through. And then, by the end of the shower or whatever, I'd be able to get out and be composed and go on with life. I didn't ever have the experience that once I started crying, I just couldn't ever stop. For me, it was helpful. It was therapeutic. It was a nice release of energy. Okay. The next one is that it's okay to take medication and it's also okay not to take medicine. So, Cameron says the feeling of wanting to crawl out of your own mind. Yeah. Okay. So I have heard it said, oh, well, if you're struggling with depression, it might be a spiritual problem. And then if you take medication, then you are, you're like avoiding dealing with the spiritual problem that you have or something like that. And that crying releases endorphins. Yes. True, Donna. Yes. Okay. So here's the thing. First of all, let's just state the obvious. There are spiritual struggles that come with every kind of suffering, right? This is not something that's unique to depression. You could have back problems and you could be, it creates temptation, right? Whenever you have ongoing suffering, you're going to struggle with all of the where is God? Why is he doing this to me? Is he good? Can I trust him? You're going to have those struggles no matter what kind of suffering you have, whether it's, like back pain or, nausea in pregnancy or some kind of financial struggle, any kind of suffering you have, it's going to come with those kind of spiritual components because it's one thing to have a struggle, but then it's another thing, how do we respond to that? Or what do we tell ourselves about it? So there's always a component of spiritual struggle there. But to tell a person, that this is probably a spiritual problem, that is just, we've already talked here tonight about the endless cycle that we can get into in our minds and how we can blame ourselves. Oh, this is, this because I don't drink enough water. Oh no, now it's even worse. It's not just I'm not drinking enough water. I don't have enough faith. I have a spiritual problem. That could go on forever. There's never going to become a point where I go, nope, it's not spiritual struggles because I have no spiritual struggles and I'm still depressed. So it's got to be a physical thing. Like, you will not get to that point, right? And so if you have some kind of spiritual struggle, and if we mean by spiritual struggle, like you're not perfected, which none of us are because we're not in heaven, and you take some medication to relieve the physical suffering that you're having, rest assured, the Lord's arm is not too short. He's still able to grow you and sanctify you and teach you whatever he needs to teach you. You cannot buy a pill, cure spiritual problems. So, don't worry that you're like cheating or something. And two, if you relieve one particular area of suffering, there are still plenty of things in life that are going to be challenging and that the Lord is going to use to draw you closer to him, to pull you deeper into his love, to show you more of his goodness and his character, to grow your faith, right? The Lord is not made, incapable of working his plan in your life simply because you relieve one particular area of suffering that you have. So it is okay to take medication. It's also okay to say, I don't really want to mess with that, or I'm not, I'm concerned about the side effects, or, I don't know if I have a doctor right now that I can trust, or I don't, whatever it might be. I felt like there was pull on both sides of that for me. People who were saying, be careful about taking medication, and other people who were, concerned that I might not take medication. And, I just think it's tricky, just like any other decision you make. It's a lot of, there's a lot of things out there. You want to research, you want to think about it. And boy, depression can really compound the amount of decision fatigue that goes on. So, yes, read, think about it, make a wise decision, do what seems right for you at the time. But know this, you are never going to be reading through your Bible, sometime in the future and find this verse that just proves that, oh, it was a sin for me to take that medication. That is not going to happen. That is not going to happen. You might, make a particular choice today and then down the road say, oh, you know what? I wish I had done something differently. Or this circumstance has come up and that is making me think we should change the decision we made. And that's fine. When new factors, new information comes into play and you need to make a change, then by all means do that. But don't do it as though it's a retroactive judgment on a choice that you made earlier with a different set of factors and information, right? We've all had this. We've changed like how we birth, or how we educate our children, or how we do our finances, or something like that. We learn more, we do differently. We don't look back and say, oh, that means I was sinning back then, or that means I was, doing it wrong before. Please don't not seek help, reach out for help. Yes. And a good doctor who prescribes medication would also encourage counseling, because, taking the medication can be really helpful, but there's another component there too of just, all the thought patterns, like we just keep on coming up with this tonight. It's complicated. People are complicated. And so, the medication can be helpful, but alongside of somebody loving, or a, medical health professional who can help us to work through all these thoughts that we've been struggling with. And so the last thing I want to say to you tonight is that I have a book that I want to recommend. And I'm going to tell you about this book. And I want you to think of it in two ways. First of all, I found this book very helpful. And I hope that if you're looking for something to read, that you would find this helpful too. But I read this for the first time after my first experience of postpartum depression. So, in looking back, I would say I'm not sure how I would have received it reading it while I was struggling with depression. Because, like I said, decision fatigue, processing information, so challenging. And so, if you look at this title and you just think like, no, I don't think I can do that, then don't do it. Or maybe if you have a loving friend who's saying, how can I love you? How can I help you? Ask them to read this book, because there's actually a fair bit in this book about how to love someone who's going through this. So the copy that I have is called Depression, A Stubborn Darkness. Now, this is an older copy, and I believe that the new title, I'll list it in the show notes, but I believe the new title is slightly different. It's something like Depression, Looking Up from a Stubborn Darkness, but it's by a guy named Ed Welch, and I've read a ton of stuff that he's written. And he's a counselor, godly man, but also a counselor. So he has, this isn't like a dry doctrinal book. It's very pastoral. It's very counselor-ish. And he basically says depression is a form of suffering. And so all the things that the scripture has to say about suffering apply to depression. And one of the things I found helpful about this book, even outside of and beyond my own particular struggles, was he just goes through a lot of like our emotional responses to things and helps to kind of piece apart like what might be behind the anger, or what might be behind the feeling of hopelessness, or whatever. It's almost like a physician's desk reference, but about, the emotions that we might experience. And I found it to be relevant even outside of and beyond the specific arena of depression and suffering in that particular way. But I did find this book helpful. So I'll link to the new title in the show notes if you are interested in that. And I have talked so long, and I think we've had such good discussion in the comments here. I don't see any questions, but I do just want to say, if you ever want to talk about this, but you'd like to do it in a more private setting, you're always welcome to email me. I'll drop in my email address here as soon as I end the live video. You're always welcome to, message me on Facebook. Susan, good. I'm glad that it was encouraging. Yeah. And what I said at the beginning, I will reiterate. These are my reflections from my own experience. Definitely, take what's helpful, completely disregard anything that's unhelpful, especially if it feels burdensome or discouraging to you. Please, I would so much rather for you to toss it out and ignore it and, decide that I don't know what I'm talking about, than that this would add 1 ounce of extra guilt or burden or shame onto you, because that is completely the opposite of my desire from tonight. So thank you, you all. Thank you for joining me this evening. And again, if you want to talk about this more outside of this format and privately, I'm happy to do that. Message me on Facebook or Instagram or email or whatever works. Very good, Joanna. I'm so thankful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you all for being here. And I will see you next week. I'm talking to Julie Bogart. So I'm very excited about that. We're going to talk about her new book. And I hope you all can join me then. Y'all have a great evening.